Hi, I'm Kate Foster. I was born in Halifax and grew up in the Annapolis Valley. I went to school in Quebec and BC before law school at Dalhousie. I worked briefly in law before I decided it wasn't for me, but I've always loved research and writing, and I pursue that when I can. I'm also a Black person who grew up without any Black family history of my own because I was adopted into a white family. So I've always been really interested in Black stories and history. I live in Dartmouth with my 2 daughters and husband, and I'm always really interested in the history around me. Othello Pollard was once a celebrated African-American chef and caterer in Boston. He was born about 1758 in Philadelphia. In Boston, he catered Harvard College events, and he had a fine food shop and restaurant near the Boston Common. He was often written about for his creative food and even inspired poetry from his patrons. He became quite well known, and unfortunately, fire destroyed his restaurant there. He moved to Halifax in the early 1800s and opened a restaurant and series of food-related businesses there. Fire again in Halifax meant that he lost his restaurant, and he had financial hardships. But despite those, he never stopped trying to overcome them and start his business anew. Unfortunately, he died in poverty. He's buried in downtown Dartmouth at the Christ Church, and his story has mostly been forgotten. I came across Othello Pollard when I was researching the Avenue, which is a historic Black community in Dartmouth at the end of Creighton Avenue, and looking at families that lived in Dartmouth in the early 1800s. I found in the 1838 census an O. Pollard, who was a cook. And I'd also seen the name Othello Pollard in The Story of Dartmouth, an old history book by John Martin. He's mentioned a few times as a famed chef who lived in the US, but who had also lived and died in poverty in Dartmouth. And I just became very curious about him. I live in an old part of Dartmouth myself, near the Avenue, near downtown here. And there's very little visible history here, visible Black history, that is. And I wanted to recapture a little bit of that history through the story of Othello Pollard, one individual. And I just think that our Black stories deserve more detail and more attention. Well, there's lots of little interesting details about Othello, but his personality was very much like a modern-day celebrity chef before that existed. He was dynamic. People were drawn in by him. He was dramatic and entertaining, and he was also very savvy and skilled. Secondly, I thought it was very interesting that he was written about in a letter by the family of the second president of the United States, John Adams. And he was praised very highly for his cooking, along with another well-known Black chef in Boston named Julian. And thirdly, he was among the first to open a fine dining style restaurant in Boston. He wasn't the first, but he was among the earliest. And it appears that in Halifax, he was the first Black person to open a restaurant in 1816. Othello was a person who was very talented. He pursued his talent and skills at a very high level and was very successful. Unfortunately, he suffered a lot of setbacks and hardship, but he never stopped trying to overcome them. And I think, again, his perseverance was really important, and he lived with great courage. I hope that people will be inspired by Othello the person and his life story. I also hope that people will be inspired to find other little or lesser known Black stories, maybe even from their own family histories, because I think that it's some of these specific and individual stories that really add depth to the rich Black history in Dartmouth and HRM. Thanks for listening today. I hope that you find the story of Othello Pollard as interesting as I did. There's lots of little details in the story itself.